Welcome back, everyone, for today's video. Actually, let me reset it. Let me do full cam. Right, let's do full cam. Turn this down and let's go. All right, welcome. Okay, let's see, we're at 212. Okay, welcome back, everyone, for today's video. We are going to be taking a look at the European Team Chess Championship being held in Budva, Montenegro. Now, today is the 5th round of the event. Now, I did not actually do a recap yesterday. Magnus Carlsen, due to the Norwegian team struggling, had a very tough match against the Finnish board 1. The game was technically a draw. Magnus would go on to win that game, and as such, he is gaining points. But today, due to the struggles of the team, Magnus once again is playing against a lower rated player, and he's playing against Ivan Skitko from Moldova. Now, Ivan Skitko needs no introduction. He is a player who actually played in the FIDE World Cup a couple months back in Baku, Azerbaijan. He actually, I believe, beat Radek Wojtaszek. He beat Sam Shanklin. Actually, might have lost in tiebreaks to Wojtaszek, but he did beat Sam Shanklin. Very close to beating Wojtaszek, so a very strong player. All right. So Magnus, as usual, is playing here with the black pieces once again, and we get this move d4. After d4, Magnus plays knight to f6. We get the move c4, g6, and now knight c3 is played by Ivan. We get bishop g7, e4, and Magnus plays d6. Now, my general thoughts about this are that Magnus wants to play openings that are a little bit off the beaten path, openings with a lot of play. Pieces don't come off the board, no quick draws, nothing super simple. And as such, with Magnus Carlsen being the 5-time world chess champion, obviously he expects to be able to outplay players, as we've seen over much of the past decade and a half. So after d6, we get h3, Magnus castles, we have bishop to e3, and now we have the move knight c6 being played here by Magnus. After knight c6, we get the move d5, and now we have knight to b4. Now, all this pretty normal up until knight c6. This knight c6 move, a little bit unusual for Magnus. Normally in this position, most players will play either the move e5 or pawn to c5. One of these two moves tends to be preferred. But again, Magnus is playing a player who is a little bit weaker or lower rated, somebody he wants to get out of theory, because as I've said many times in my recent videos, you do not want to play opening theory against a weaker player, because then you're just playing against Stockfish, and what's the point of playing at all? So after d5, we get knight to b4. Now we have a3 being played here by Ivan. Magnus goes knight to a6, and now we have this move bishop d3. Now, as you guys can tell by the evaluation bar, the computer already hates Magnus's position, but as Magnus has proved, it doesn't really matter how bad the bar is as long as you're not losing and the moves are not super simple. So we get knight to c5 from Magnus, bishop c2 played here by Ivan. Of course, white would love to keep the light square bishop on the board because black is trying to pressure the pawn on e4. So after bishop to c2, we get the move knight f d7, and now Ivan plays knight ge2, finishing his development essentially by bringing the knight to the center and castling the king. And Magnus, you might be wondering, what is he doing here? He's castled the king, he's got the bishop on g7, but he has these knights on c5 and d7, and nothing else is developed whatsoever, and it really looks like Magnus is simply playing random moves. So Magnus goes a5 here, a move which is intended to perhaps stop b4, which would kick the horse out of town. After a5, we get castles, and now Magnus plays the move knight b6, trying to attack the pawn on c4, and Ivan plays b3, simply guarding the pawn. Here Magnus goes e5, and the reason behind e5 is that Magnus now wants to play a classic King's Indian with f5, f4, g5, g4, and storming with the pawns on the king side. Now we get rook to b1 from Ivan, and Magnus plays knight cd7. Now, Magnus probably would have liked to have played f5 here, but the problem with f5 in this position is that white can trade the pawns and play a move like f4 here, stopping black from playing f4, for example, because if black could get f4 and open up this long diagonal for the light square bishop, black has a lot of play. But after f4, say we get e4, for example, white can play bishop to d4, get this knight on d4, and white is much better because now you have this horrible light square bishop walled in behind the pawns. White has this great knight which can potentially jump to e6 down the road, and black is in a lot of trouble. So Magnus decides to play knight cd7 back. Ivan plays bishop d3. Magnus plays knight c5, bishop c2, knight d7, and now Ivan plays bishop d3, telling Magnus that, hey, look, bro, you might be 28-29 and I might be 25-03, but I'm happy with a draw because I'm going to be gaining a couple of rating points. So Magnus says no draw. He plays f5 because, of course, Magnus cannot afford to draw games because he will lose rating points, and maybe that'll let Fabiano Caruana creep closer to him for the #1 spot overall. So after f5 we get f3 from Ivan, trying to overprotect this big center. We of course have a classic pyramid of Giza here with the pawns from b3 to d5 and f3 to d5 as well. Magnus goes knight c5. We get b4 here because Ivan now realizes with f5 and f3 being included, if he tries to play bishop c2 again, Magnus will not go back to d7. Magnus will now almost certainly play something like f4, g5, h5, g4 and go on the rampage. So Ivan decides to go here with b4, attacking the knight on c5, and what this also does is it forces Magnus to simplify the position. So Magnus trades the knight for the bishop on d3. He goes knight back to d7. Now this is already much worse than normal King's Indian, because in a lot of King's Indians, if I just set up a normal position, for example, say you got some normal King's Indian without h3, just to show you guys something, generally speaking, when you get a position like, let's just say this, you'll notice that at the start of this whole line, black first of all has two knights, but also all the pieces are coming over towards the king's side. So when we get back to the position here in the Magnus game, when we look at this, Magnus has now retrieved his knight from the queen's side. He's wasted time, he's pushing his pieces back, and he's really hoping that Ivan will make a mistake here and he'll be able to attack once again. So here Ivan starts playing on the queen side with c5 here, very thematic pawn push in the King's Indian. White wants to go for knight b5 and pressure these pawns on c7 and d6. So in this position, after c5, Magnus trades on b4, and now we get this move knight to f6. Now I really don't like this trade by Magnus on b4 here, because if he had played knight f6 right away, one of the key ideas that exists in the game would not be available here. Because if white were to say play a move like c6 and b6, for example, which I will mention in a second, you'll notice that this a file is completely closed here and white cannot go rook a1. Whereas in the game, after takes and knight f6, if Magnus's opponent Ivan Skitko had played c6 here, computer says after b6 and rook a1, white is doing very well. In fact, Sessa, the Norwegian supercomputer, gives white an advantage of about 1.5 here, so black would be in a lot of trouble. And the main reason for that is the two b's are not very good. This dark square b, no scope on the diagonal. Light square b, no scope either. So both of these b's are very cramped, and black is in a lot of trouble. Instead, Ivan plays rook a1, which also is a very logical human move to play here. And this is the other reason I really didn't like pawn takes pawn, because I don't think that Ivan would have played c6 with the pawns on a3 and a5. And secondarily, it also would have taken away this rook a1 idea altogether. So after rook to a1, Magnus takes on e4, and now Ivan makes a mistake. He takes here with the pawn and not with the knight. Now, generally speaking, when you play King's Indian structures, this specific structure, I should say, where you have these pawns on c5, d5, and then the connect 4, normally you always look to capture the pawn on c5, and you also look to capture the pawn on e4, because almost universally, black tries to play f4, h5, g5, and go for a big attack, rather than trading off pawns on e4. But after pawn takes pawn, if Ivan had played knight takes e4, the computer gives white a very big advantage, and the main reason is that if black trades the rooks here, and he trades the knights, once again, the b's are very bad. The dark square b is hemmed in behind the pawn chain. Light square b has very limited scope here, actually no scope at all, I should say, because it gets captured by all the pawns. And for that reason, white is a little bit better, but black also has no chances to win the game. So Ivan instead plays this move f takes e4 here, and after f takes e4, now Magnus starts to get some chances because he swaps the towers on a1 and he goes for knight h5, activating the horse, going for knight f4. And what Magnus is hoping to do is, say you play like rook b1, knight f4 takes, suddenly both of the diagonals are completely open. Black can play f3 to undermine the chain, and the two b's will eventually win the game for black. So after knight h5, it already feels like the Magnus effect is back in fashion. His opponent's made a couple of inaccuracies, but will Magnus be able to win against his much lower rated opponent? So here after knight to h5, we get the move rook to f1, which I think is pretty much the only move here, because if you don't go rook f1 and trade off some pieces, black will probably be winning with knight f4 and queen g5, or with the two b's. So we get rook f1, Magnus trades the rooks here, and now he plays queen f6 check, bishop to f2, very good move. But we get knight to f4. So now Magnus has gotten pretty much the maximum he can ask for. He's hoping down the road to activate this light square bishop, but he's really hoping to activate this dark square bishop on the long diagonal. So here Ivan, shockingly to me at least, as I was covering this live on my Kick channel, traded the knights on f4. Now to me this is stunning, because when I look at this position from a human standpoint, just conceptually, it seems very clear to me that black's dark square bishop here after a move like queen b5, there's no scope on the diagonal, the queen cannot get into the game, and for that reason the bishop and the queen are simply not that active. Now after queen b5 and say queen f7, for example, computer says after queen c4, white retains a very small advantage here due to the pressure on the c file, and maybe white can create more. A computer obviously would probably win this with white, but nonetheless from a human perspective it doesn't make all that much sense. That being said, I still expected something like takes and maybe even queen b6 to be played. Instead Ivan decides to trade the knights. Now after knight takes knight and pawn takes knight, the computer still says that white is okay here, but the line or the thread sort of to hold the balance is very, very delicate, because now the queen is getting in, bishop is active on the diagonal, there's always this f3 threat to undermine the pawn chain, and you really figure Magnus will get winning chances. So Ivan plays knight to b5, Magnus checks on a1, we get the move king to e2, we have queen to b2, and now Ivan correctly plays his move king to f3. Now I was stunned to see this, because to me I expected white to play bishop e1 here, simply because there's a lot of pressure on the pawns on c7 and d6. On the other hand, however, if you play bishop to e1, you do self-pin yourself with the bishop and the king on the back rank. So in this position we get the move king to e2, queen b2, and king f3. If white were to play king f1, very natural looking move, hoping to make a repetition here, black can now play f3, and after f3 the computer says that black is winning here, and the reason is now everything starts to collapse. If you take the pawn with the queen, for example, now black can take on c5, and you probably think, well, what's the big deal? If you take with a pawn, you hang the knight, of course, but if you take with a bishop, so what's going on? But the problem is that now black can play b6, attacking the bishop. And when you move the bishop away, spaghetti-o, the light square bishop has entered the action, and the knight on b5 is going to fall. So after d takes c5, black is much better. You've c4, b3, b2. White really doesn't have any play in the center of the board here, and for that reason black will win. So very impressively, Ivan actually goes king to f3 here, putting this king on the square. Now one of the reasons I did not expect this move in the game is because of what Magnus does, which is he plays g5 here, guarding the pawn on f4, but more importantly he intends to play h5 and g4 and attack this white king on f3 vociferously, meanwhile not caring at all about these pawns, because if you can checkmate the king or the monarch, you win the game. So after g5, Ivan takes, we get this move h5 here. Now keep in mind, of course, computer says it's balanced, but you don't know what's going to happen, especially because Ivan is starting to get a little bit low on time here. He's down to about 9 minutes. His king is it's a little bit scared, the king on f3, g4 is incoming, and you're not really sure. But Ivan does keep his wits about him, and he now plays this move bishop d4, a very, very important move here, because it gets rid of this dark square bishop, potentially offering a big trade. Magnus, of course, is having none of it. He keeps going on with the attack g4. Of course, any chance black has to mate will involve the 2b's and the queen, so you cannot trade off material. After g4, we get h takes g4, bishop takes g4 from Magnus. Magnus, at long last, on move number 35, has finally activated his light square bishop, and it's better late than never. So we get king takes f4. Magnus plays this move queen takes g2 here. Now Magnus, if he were to try this move bishop to h6, this actually, it gives white some chance to win the game, because after king to g3 back, guarding the pawn on g2, when black plays queen c1 trying to checkmate here, white can now play the shocking move king to h2, and you think, well, wait, bishop f4, but after g3 there are no checks on the second rank here. All the squares are covered by the white queen and the bishop. f3 is also covered, and for that reason white is much better. So Magnus decides to play queen takes g2 here. Skitko decides to trade the bishops on g7, and now he finds a very, very important move, which is e5 on move number 38. Now the reason this move is so important is that you probably think, well, wait, just take the pawn, why not? But if you take the pawn after queen to f2 checking the king, it doesn't matter which way you go with the king. After king g5, queen f6 would be checkmate here, and if you go to e5, it's the same thing. Queen f6 is also gg, why not? So you do have to be very careful, but Ivan really keeps his nerve about him here, and he plays this move e5, which is very important, because what it does is it takes away this f6 square from the queen. So after we get this move e5 being played here, now we have the move king to h6 being played by Magnus, trying really, really hard again to go for some tricks. If white takes on c7, Queen f2, king e4, bishop f5. Spaghetti-o. The king once again is caught in the mating net, and it's GG, why not? So Magnus continuing to try, desperately trying to win this game to avoid losing some rating points, but now Ivan plays the move queen to e3, another best move in this position, because the idea now is that you're going to move the king and then you're going to create the fossil where you check the king on h6. After queen to e3, Magnus takes on d6, and now we get this move knight takes d6. I don't know if e takes d6 is okay or not, but if you don't see a checkmate here, it makes sense to take with a knight because you keep the 2 pawns in the center of the board. You can always move the king, and now it's very clear that Magnus will not be able to create a checkmate or a mating net in this position. So Magnus decides to play queen takes d5 here, and now we get the move knight to e4 from Ivan, bringing the knight back. He can create a bastion with knight to f6. He can also walk the king back to g3, and most importantly, the players have reached move 40, which means that Ivan now gets 30 minutes. He can relax, take a breather, and sort of reset himself, and it's clear now that if anybody is better, it is white, and Magnus needs to be very careful. So Magnus decides here to play the move king to g6 in this position. After king g6, we get queen b6 here, and after queen b6, queen to c6 is played by Magnus. He could have played bishop to e6, but if he plays bishop e6, we would have gotten the classic yo-yo draw with queen to g1 check, bishop g4, queen b6, and white yo-yos with the queen back and forth. So in this position, after queen to c6 here, we now get the move queen takes c6 being played by Ivan. And the reason for this is very simple. Ivan cannot really try to keep the game going here. If you play a move like queen to d8, maybe you can keep it going, but after queen c1, queen d2, white has to worry about all the checks around his king, and you don't really want to have to deal with that at all if possible. And so for that reason, why go for that when you can simply trade the queens on c6? So Ivan trades the queens on c6, and Magnus decides to take the draw here. Magnus could have played on with pawn takes queen, but the game would have ended in a draw very shortly thereafter. There are a couple ways to draw this. I would probably say the simplest way to draw this here would be to play the move knight to c3. And now black has to go bishop d7, because otherwise you play like bishop e6, b5 takes, very simple draw. You have to go bishop to d7 here, but now after bishop to d7, white can go knight to e2, and when you play king f7, white goes knight d4, creating the bastion. The knight and the pawn basically hold everything here. Black can't actually move forward. Pawn covers the 2 squares in front, knight covers a square, pawn on b4 stops c5, and black has no chance of winning. And so most likely after knight to e2, you get h4, knight d4, probably h3, king g3, and now after king to f7, many ways for it to end, but probably simplest is e6, takes, something like bishop c8, and eventually black brings the king over to take the pawn on b4. White will win the pawn on h3, and the game will be a draw. So very, very interesting game. Magnus tries very hard to win this game. Pretty much a nothing burger opening, but he's able to start creating complications. Unfortunately for Magnus, his opponent was up to the task, had just enough time, did not fall victim to the Magnus effect, kept calculating very well, and the game did end in a draw. So unfortunately for Magnus, it's a draw. I do believe Norway is about to lose another match to Moldova today. The Norwegian team is struggling mightily in this event, in spite of Magnus doing his best to sort of prop the team up or keep it going and give them some morale, but the whole team is struggling, so they're likely going to lose to Moldova, which means again Magnus will probably play another much weaker opponent tomorrow. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 5 of the European Team Chess Championship in Budva, Montenegro. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back very soon with some more great recaps here on YouTube.